is in Sunday school, and the Sunday school class, one of the things that they've decided at this point is that they're going to talk about other faiths. Okay? So my daughter has a perspective when they talk about Buddhism that the other kids her age may have lacked, right? But what's the point here? That there is this relationship that just takes place. The concern here is secondarily proclamation, right? In the sense that when my daughters get asked what they believe in, the conversation usually goes like this: my daughters will ask, "Do you want to come to church with us?" Then they'll say, "Well, we go to the temple." They'll come back and ask me, "What's the temple?" Then I'll tell them a little bit what the temple is, and they'll go back and they'll talk about the temple and the church and their mutual experiences. Now the point is, right? Although my daughters initiated this conversation, now it's not a matter. They know they're going to the temple, but they're interacting at the level of, well, you tell me what you're doing, I tell you what I'm doing. And well, who knows what's going to happen from there? We'll see what happens. But oftentimes, I think, at a higher level of interaction, when we are building these kinds of relationships, right? If we start switching gears and coming on too forwardly, if you will, then the other party is probably going to draw back a little bit, right? Unless, of course, they're really, if you will, they're seekers. In which case, if they want to hear more, then I say, by all means, tell them. But that's a little different situation when you have somebody that is fairly comfortable where they're at. They're not looking to necessarily join our church, but they might be interested in hearing what you've got to say. So what happens in that case is a sort of mutual dialogue, which is different from this sort of monologuing evangelism, right? Where you've got a mutual conversation going on. You're learning about what the other person is saying. They're learning about what you're saying. You're in the process, hopefully, coming to understand a little bit more precisely what is involved in this kind of religious life. Perhaps stereotypes that you have about this other tradition are being exposed to what they are. Hopefully, in the process, you're sharing some things about what it means to be a Christian that are also illuminating to the other person, as well as perhaps breaking some stereotypes about what they have about Christianity. Okay? This is this mutual dialogue here, in which you have a relationship. And the goal of the relationship may or may not be a conversion of one or the other two. Usually it's the case that if it's a specific goal that you have, either way, meaning the other person coming into this conversation, you coming into this conversation, wanting to convert the other, what's going to happen over time is you're going to sense the other person's not wanting to convert, and what are you going to do? Yeah, you're just going to withdraw. I'm not wasting my time with this. Right? And mutually on the other side. They're going to say, well, how stubborn and bullheaded this Christian is. I'm not going to waste my time with this person. Right? Well, I mean, if that's the way that the conversation goes, well, that's the way the conversation goes. But if it's a matter, let's say, of you're working with a work colleague who's got a cube right next to you, and you can't quite say, well, forget that person. You have to work with them right for the next. Who knows? You can leave your job, I suppose. You could leave their position. But if you're in one sense stuck, then of course you know that the whole point of this conversation is not that you're going to try to convert this. If this person converts, well, hey, it's great. But my point in this relationship is not to chalk one up for the Lord, if you know what I mean. All right? So in this particular kind of situation, what we find ourselves doing is we find ourselves entering into a mutual relationship, and who knows where that relationship is going to if it goes anywhere. Okay, relationships take time, they take effort. They take a willingness to make ourselves vulnerable. They take the willingness to try to empathize with someone else's perspective, try to understand where they're coming from. And oftentimes, the only way that can really happen is if we get to know them. And the only way they can understand where we're coming from is if they take the same risk. They take the risk of getting to know us. And of course, the only way we can encourage them to take the risk of getting to know us is if we don't present ourselves in a threatening way. Right? If they sense that we're out to get them, they're never going to take the risk of getting to know us. Same way with you, wouldn't it be? I mean, if you sense that this colleague of yours was really out to evangelize you from an Islamic perspective, your defenses would be up right away, right? And you'd be much less willing to engage them in a mutual conversation. But if you sense, well, here's a Muslim who's not, I don't think this person is going to be flying planes anytime soon, or whatever. And in fact, this person has been working here for a while, and they're a decent human being and perhaps even kind, and let's talk, let's get to know one another. We're going to sit together for a while here. What happens in that kind of relationship? Who knows what happens in that kind of relationship? But that's, I think, another way in which we can talk about very Christian witness, right? It's not about trying to find out everything that we agree about. No. I mean, the whole point of a dialogue would be, what is it about you that makes you different? In a sense, right? So that part of that conversation will involve you bearing witness, you giving testimony. And you hope that this other person will give a genuine testimony to what really makes them tick. Because then you'll be able to appreciate much better how their faith works in your life. Right? Of course, I mean, you don't want to be hit with it all the first time you talk, right? And as relation grows, you begin to see, oh, this person is really a person of faith. And it's challenging my understanding of how, faith and following the way of the prophet works. In this case, let's say for a Muslim. So what we have then is this building of relationships in which now you can hopefully see there's a much larger depth of personal involvement, where you are interacting with somebody in a way that you're not in control of. In a monologue, I'm in control. See, I can say this if I want you to talk back to me, or I can ignore your hands and you put them up. I'm in control of this conversation, right? In an actual dialogue, you're not in control. It takes two to tango, right? And then in that case, we have to give up a little bit of control in order for that genuine relationship to take place. Now again, hopefully we're seeing that this is not exclusionary, right? We're not talking about doing one against the other or instead of the other. We're not saying any one of these are better. We're not ranking them. Again, I'm not ranking these in what's best, what's better, worst, better, and best. My ranking here is in terms of the whole personal involvement to get us to see, in one sense, how much more challenging this one is. In one sense, it's a lot easier to just proclaim because there's nothing I'm being vulnerable to. I might be vulnerable to ridicule, But in one sense, by stepping up here to the platform, I'm taking that risk, and I feel like I can handle that, right? If you sort of laugh at me walking out the door, well, you just didn't understand me. But no, that's not. My point is that I think there's a very minimal amount of vulnerability involved in this kind of relationship. But there's a lot more involved when you start really, getting your hands dirty in terms of really building this kind of mutuality in the relationship. All right, we're going to move on quickly. How about mutual worship and prayer? Wow, okay, now we start to get at a place where this is even possible, right? If you take worship from a Christian perspective as to use, Paul's phrase in Romans chapter 12, a giving of oneself completely over to God with all that we are, heart, mind, body, soul, and strength. If that's what worship is it possible for us to gather and worship and pray with those in other faiths? That's a challenging kind of. You can see how that's not just a dialogical investment there of time, of personality. This is an investment of all that we are in the context of a mutual prayer. Is that even possible? So let's move on here and talk about the different ways in which this might take place. And we can see again how this goes an increasing level of intensity in terms of personal involvement, right? There are what we might call public gatherings, mostly in civic contexts, let's say, in which we find ourselves gathered together with a large group of people surrounding common issues or something like that. And then you notice how, at a Democratic convention or Republican convention, prayers are pretty abstract. You know what I'm trying to say? In this sense, right, that it's sort of okay to talk about God, but to talk about Jesus Christ gets very, very particular in those kinds of contexts. Everybody follow what I'm trying to say? Okay. And of course, here's the challenge, right? The God that Christians worship is the God of Jesus Christ. The God of Jesus Christ. The God that Muslims worship, Allah, is the one who has sent the prophet, Muhammad. Okay. If you're going to pray in a public context, you'd be just as much in trouble saying the God of Jesus Christ as you would Allah, merciful, and compassionate, the one who sent the prophet. Both of those are common prayers, common addresses in the respective communities. But in the public context of prayer, we're safest in that context saying something like God. It's generic enough, it's vague enough, it's ambiguous enough, that in one sense everybody can sort of, except unless you're a Buddhist, right? If you don't believe in a personal God, then you let the Buddhists out. But we don't have enough Buddhists in the country yet to make a big stink about it, so we haven't had to deal with that issue. But what's the point? That in a public multi-faith context, listen to those prayers the next time, and you'll see really how, in one sense, at one level, there's very little theological content. Some would say that's what makes those kinds of prayers irrelevant or not valid religious prayers at all. Others would say, there's something powerful that takes place in the context in which different people from different religious traditions get together and invoke God as creator, which of course Christians, Jews, and Muslims all recognize that there's one God. And this is, of course, partly philosophical. But if there's one God, and this God creates, and Jews, Muslims, and Christians all believe that their God is the creator God, then doesn't it in one sense make sense to say that when they say God the creator, they're all agreeing about who that God is? At one level, that seems like a no-brainer. Then, of course, you've got the other question of the God of Jesus Christ versus the God of the prophet. And so we're back, in one sense, at that point, to a kind of disagreement. But let's move on a little bit here. Let's get a little bit closer to home. Right? Is it possible for us to pray together in a more cultic environment? By cultic, I don't mean like those cults. By cultic, all cult means is simply a means of worship. Okay? Cult is means of worship, and so a liturgical environment. Is it possible for us to, I'm not sure if this has ever been done, but for us to have a interfaith gathering in our sanctuary here, where we bring together people from various faiths, and then we invite them into a kind of, let's say, more generic kind of worship, but then we pray together. Now you do that in a Christian building, let's say a sanctuary, with a cross with the kind of symbolism that way. So there's a certain kind of feel to it that makes it much more challenging for somebody else to really enter into a kind of engagement, right, with your prayer. That's much more available in a public space without the sacred symbols quite as clear. Alternatively, when I teach courses in world religions at the schools I'm at, I take my students, who are mostly Christian, to visit other religious sites. I take them to visit Buddhist temples, for example. And oftentimes I will invite them to sit in on an instructional session by one of the leaders of their site to teach them meditation if they want to. Right? This will be in a Buddhist hall, Buddhist meditational hall, where they will learn to sit down and I tell them, if you're not comfortable doing that, you don't have to do that. That's simply up to you. Okay, but this is a challenge, right, for Christians, right? Can we enter into another environment in the same way as we would invite someone else into our sanctuary and say, would you like to participate with us in what we're doing? You can see that involves a lot deeper level of personal commitment, involvement, willingness to try out something new. Not for everybody. Some people might take up our invitation to come in here. Some of you might take up the invitation of somebody else to go and visit and participate in some of their ritual ceremonies and their particular religious sites. But this, of course, is a much more challenging kind of situation. How about the kind of interpersonal prayer at the level of two people? Let's go back to this first model earlier we talked about, relationship building. Okay? In one sense, this interpersonal prayer is easier than a cultic or liturgical prayer. In a cultic or liturgical prayer, in one sense, there's a leader that is directing the flow of what's going on, and so that leader is more or less in charge, right? So that the individual sort of either has to protest but silently, not participate fully, or risk entering into the experience. In interpersonal, personal different, right? I mean, it's kind of situation would take place in a number of different ways, it seems to me. As we, let's say, become more and more involved and our relationships deepen, let's say with a colleague in the next cubicle that I work with, right? Over time, you know, naturally as human beings, you share, you know, your testimonies,